Welcome to the deep dive.
Hi there.
Today we're looking at J.K. Rowling, obviously a huge name, author of, well, you know what she wrote,
Hard to miss.
and someone whose public voice has become, let's say, very prominent in certain discussions lately.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've got a really interesting set of materials that you, our listener, actually shared with us.
Yeah, that's right.
We're talking analyses of her social media, fact checks of things she supposedly said or wrote, all aimed at getting a handle on her publicly stated views.
Exactly. So our mission here is to, well, dig into all this material, pull out the main insights, and really understand the knowledge and the perspectives that are presented in these sources about Rowling's public statements.
Sort of a shortcut, maybe?
Yeah, think of it like getting up to speed on a pretty complex and often discussed topic without having to wade through every single article and tweet yourself.
And these sources, they cover quite a range. We'll be looking at how she uses platforms like Twitter or X now.
Right.
The themes that seem to keep coming up in what she says.
Uh-huh.
And, specific moments or statements that really got people talking, or basically trying to map out the core messages from this specific collection of material.
Okay, sounds good. So where do we start? Her use of Twitter, maybe X?
Yeah, let's start there. The sources suggest that as of, well, now May 2025, she's still pretty active on the platform.
Okay.
And one thing that pops up in the analysis is, interestingly, her Twitter header images.
Her headers? Really?
Yeah, apparently they become a bit of a thing. Like, people try to decode them.
Huh. Decode them for what?
Well, the material we looked at highlights a few different ways. Sometimes they seem to hint at her writing projects or just general inspirations. We saw examples like art references.
Art, like what?
The Three Fates, Venita's still life painting, even Death on the Pale Horse, things like that.
Wow. Okay, so quite highbrow references.
It suggests a certain depth of interest, yeah. And it's not just art.
No.
The sources mention specific places, too. Yorkminster Cathedral, Cromer Pier. There was one called the Lion's Mouth.
The lion's mouth. Okay, intriguing. Like little visual breadcrumbs?
Kind of. And sometimes their symbolism involves swans. Pelicans were mentioned.
Right.
And then, more obviously, sometimes they're direct teasers for her books.
Ah, okay.
Like
Yeah.
The Ichabod, The Christmas Pig, The Running Grave, more recently.
Yeah, so it's a mix of subtle hints and direct promotion.
Exactly. It seems like quite a deliberate, sort of multi-layered way she engages with her audience through that space.
And the sources say this actually generates discussion.
Oh, yeah. Lots of fan talk, apparently,
Yep.
but also some more, formal analysis. People are actively trying to figure out what these images might mean. Hints about future plots, maybe? Or characters?
Interesting. It shows how every part of a public figure's online presence can be scrutinized, doesn't it?
Definitely. Her Twitter isn't just opinions. It's almost like an extension of her fictional world sometimes, open to all sorts of interpretation.
Okay. Now, moving on from the headers, there's a theme that, well, it really dominates the material provided, doesn't it?
You mean sex and gender identity?
Exactly. The sources make it clear this has become a really central and often controversial part of her online activity.
Yeah, particularly heating up around 2019, 2020, it seems.
And what's the core message coming through the sources about her stance here?
Well, the consistent thing is her emphasis on biological sex.
Okay.
The material suggests she sees it as, well, fundamental, really important, especially when discussing women's rights and the idea of single-sex spaces.
Right. And the sources mention examples like her questioning certain language.
Yes, like her expressing concern about using phrases like people who menstruate instead of women.
Why the concern, according to the sources?
Her perspective, as presented, is that this kind of language risks erasing the specific experiences linked to biological sex for women.
Okay. And this led to specific actions or tweets mentioned.
Definitely. The sources point to her public support for people who face backlash for expressing what get called gender-critical views.
Like Maya Forstater.
Exactly. That's a key example. Her tweet from December 2019 is cited. Force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real. Hashtag I stand with Maya. Pretty direct.
Yeah. And Allison Bailey was another name mentioned.
Yes, another individual she supported in that context.
Now, the sources are also clear that these views have attracted a lot of criticism.
Oh, absolutely. Accusations of transphobia are frequently mentioned.
And her response to that label?
The sources say she rejects it. She frames her concerns as being about protecting women's rights and existing safe spaces for women.
We also saw mention of something more recent, Scotland's hate speech law.
Right. April 2024. her criticism of that law, using the hashtag #ArrestMe.
So still very much engaged with legal and social changes she sees as impacting this area.
Seems so. It shows a willingness to, push back publicly against things she disagrees with on this topic.
Okay. Now, there's another theme that feels deeply connected to this, according to the sources.
Violence against women.
Yes. This comes across as a really powerful, maybe even a driving force behind some of her positions, and very personal.
Very personal. The sources specifically reference that June 2020 essay she wrote.
The one where she disclosed her own experiences.
Exactly. Revealing she's a survivor of domestic abuse and sexual assault. The material really stresses how this personal history shapes her views.
How so? What's the connection made in the sources?
The connection is to her focus on women's safety, and particularly the importance she places on single-sex spaces.
So the argument presented is that her experience informs her concern about potential risks.
Yes. Her argument, as outlined in these sources, is that allowing biological males who identify as women into spaces designated for women could potentially endanger natal women and girls.
And this concern isn't just theoretical for her, is it? The sources mention practical action, too.
Right, Beaver's Place. The support service she launched in Edinburgh in December 2022, specifically for female survivors of sexual violence, women only, and she funded it herself.
So putting her resources behind that specific vision of safety.
Seems that way. It demonstrates a pretty tangible commitment based on those views.
And the sources give specific examples of her tweeting about this, too.
Yeah, there's a May 2025 tweet quoted something like, "Locking women up with men or forcing them to agree that a man is a woman constitutes a human rights violation." Strong words.
Very strong. And there was something about media reporting, too.
Uh-huh. Also, May 2025, criticizing reports that avoided using male pronouns for a convicted sex offender.
Which connects back to her broader point about acknowledging sex in these contexts.
Precisely. It's all quite consistent with that core concern.
There was also a mention of sports, boxing.
Yes. July 2024. Concerns about potential harm to female athletes in women's boxing if trans women compete, again, framed as a safety and fairness issue for natal women.
And it's worth remembering, the sources mention she's faced threats over this.
Yeah, that July 2022 tweet is referenced, where she talks about receiving endless death and rape threats for speaking out on gender issues.
Making the point they aren't just mean comments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That the pushback can be severe and threatening.
Okay. So given that strong focus, it's perhaps interesting that the sources also highlight her support for reproductive rights.
It might seem like a different area, but the sources are quite clear on it.
How so?
They give examples of tweets where she explicitly states her support for access to safe, legal abortion.
Okay.
There's one from May 2022 responding to someone's story where she says, "Stories like these are a huge part of the reason I believe women all over the world should have access to safe, legal abortion."
Pretty unequivocal.
Seems so. And another from June 2022 after Roe v. Wade was overturned in the U.S.
What did she say then?
Something about it being more proof that women's rights are under attack across the developed world, linking it to a broader attack.
And the sources even mentioned something from earlier, 2017.
Yeah, her opposition to the reinstatement of the Mexico City policy, which relates to funding for abortion services globally.
Okay. And the fact-checking aspect of the sources came up here too?
It did, mentioning a debunked, fabricated tweet about abortion that was falsely attributed to her.
Which just reinforces that point about needing to verify things, especially online.
Definitely. Misinformation is clearly a factor in these discussions.
Right. So we've talked a lot about sex, gender, women's safety, reproductive rights. Does the material touch on other forms of discrimination?
It does, though maybe not with the same sustained focus as the gender issues in her recent output, according to these sources.
But there are examples.
Yes, certainly. There's a really notable one from July 2017 highlighted.
What was that?
Her very strong condemnation of a newspaper column that was described as sexist and anti-Semitic.
Wow, what did she say?
The sources quote her tweet, "Women and Jews quite literally deserve what they get. This filth was published in the Sunday Times. Let that sink in for a moment."
That is powerful. Very direct condemnation.
Absolutely. But the sources do note that something like the gender pay gap, mentioned in that column, isn't a topic she seems to address consistently now.
Okay. What about discrimination in employment? Does that come up again?
Yes, it does, often linked back to the gender-critical context.
Yeah.
Her support for Maya Forstater is framed as opposing discrimination for stating sex is real.
Right.
And support for someone called Roz Adams in May 2024 describes as a counselor disciplined over issues related to choice for sexual assault victims.
Okay.
And there was even an offer she apparently made in a May 24 and 2025 tweet to fund legal action for sex discrimination in employment.
So connecting it back to biological sex discrimination?
Primarily, yes.
Oh.
Although there's an interesting tweet mentioned from September 2024
Oh, yeah?
where she apparently suggested she would march against discrimination targeting trans people in things like jobs or housing,
Right.
while also sort of questioning if that kind of discrimination is actually happening on a wide scale currently.
Mm.
It adds maybe a layer of nuance.
Yeah. A bit more complexity there. And there was one more recent legal point.
April 16th, 2025. A tweet mentioned where she discusses a UK Supreme Court ruling about the definition of woman and what that means for employers and equality law.
So thinking about the practical legal implications again.
Seems to be a focus, yes. How these definitions play out in law and policy.
Okay. Now, as we sort of draw towards summarizing, it's really important to acknowledge what the sources themselves highlight, right? The context around all this.
Absolutely crucial. The sources consistently point out that her views are, well, highly polarizing,
To say the least.
and they've drawn significant criticism. Many people, as the sources note, view her statements as transphobic and causing real harm.
That's a major part of the reaction, clearly.
And the sources also bring up the argument that her focus might be seen as selective,
How so?
that perhaps she prioritizes her specific concerns about sex and gender identity over maybe a broader look at all gender-based violence, which would include violence against trans women, for example.
That's an important perspective included in the material.
And finally, just to reiterate that point, because the sources stress it,
Fact-checking.
yes, the absolute need to fact-check claims about what she has or hasn't said, because there's clearly misinformation floating around.
Okay. So if we were to try and, pull together the main threads from this deep dive into the sources you shared, what are the key takeaways?
Well, based purely on this material, several themes really stand out.
Go on.
There's that very clear, central, ongoing focus on sex and gender identity.
Right. That's undeniable.
Then, a really strong emphasis on women's safety, which the sources strongly link to her own stated personal experiences.
Uh-huh. Informed by her past.
Then there's the express support for reproductive rights, which is clearly stated in the provided examples.
Okay.
And finally, maybe a more selective engagement with other kinds of discrimination, often circling back to employment issues related to gender-critical beliefs.
That seems like a fair summary of what's in this particular set of sources.
And just to be clear, this deep dive offers a consolidated view of this material. It's meant to help you get a more informed handle on a complex figure based on what we were given to analyze.
A way to understand the discussion points presented in these specific documents.
Exactly.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to take away. Considering this range of issues Rowling has touched on as presented in these sources, what strikes you most? What does it reveal, perhaps, about her priorities, or even about the wider social conversations happening right now around these topics?
Yeah, and what other questions does this exploration raise for you personally? Something to think about.
Definitely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.